funding money system. When we commissioned John Mell to write the first paper he wrote for us, he did, I can't remember, we gave him 10 days work, did it kind of on time, straight away, and it was really straightforward, kind of, what does it mean for an arts organisation to kind of thrive, or, an assist and so on. But when we asked him to start writing about intelligent funding, he just completely, I don't know if you know John. John's he's a consultant, used to work with the Work Foundation, worked a lot at Number 10, New Labour, but mostly writing kind of about social policy, but got kind of interested in culture. Kind of is himself. He goes to the theatre quite a lot. Is now deeply involved in culture. Was involved in the No Boundaries conference that was in Bristol and was it Yorkshire?
York.
Yeah, York. That's right. Just recently. And so this is 2005, he got involved with MMM. You've probably heard, I don't know how much you all know about the history of MMM, but we set it up. Claire Cooper was then at Arts and Business, and I was running the Durham Foundation. And at the time, there was a period where there were a constant set of governance and or funding crises that all seemed to kind of stem from similar operational issues. So we decided to create, between us, a kind of big conference, Chatham House Rules. John Tusa chaired it, to start to address the fundamentals of what might be happening. We got Adrian Enns to write a series of case studies of organisations we thought were doing really well. And we invited a series of organisations who were really struggling. ENO at that point was one of them. Baltic was another. And I honestly can't remember who the other struggling organisations. Those I remember. They were having a particularly difficult time. It was really impressive. They came along and spoke really candidly to a group of about 130 leaders of world arts organisations from around the country about kind of the issues. Some of them were financial, some of them were human, some of them were funding, quite a lot of it was governance related. And similarly, the case study, and out of that came a paper that Adrian Ellis wrote called Mission Models Money, and it was basically saying, we live in an overextended, undercapitalised system. The kind of rock solid approach for a not-for-profit is to focus on mission, which we kind of all now know, but that anything that takes you off mission has an impact on money and model, so you've got to be really clear about whatever takes you kind of off piste. And that in that context you've got a wider environment which includes the funders who may have that negative impact on you, so be really wary of how that, the impact of even taking a massive grant might have on your mission. I mean, most of that is now kind of, pretty professionalised. It was kind of early days. From that conference, we decided to run another one, but this time it was the first year of the CLAW Leadership Programme, and we persuaded the CLAW Leadership folk to appoint groups of CLAW, the new first cadre of CLAW fellows, to work with kind of senior leaders across the arts, to research specific issues that had come up from that first conference. So look at what might good governance look like, what might different financial models look like. We looked at skills and capacities. We're talking just about 10 years ago. And that kind of, so all of that work was then presented at the second conference, and as a result of that, we kind of then went into the later stages of MMM as an action research programme. And it was after that it was during that second phase that we kind of touched on this thing that kept coming up, that actually the funders in the system, we wanted to try and have a different kind of conversations with the funders in the system, so that, because it wasn't just the organisations themselves that were coming across, but it was the systemic issues that were, and of course, as I said earlier, we've kind of gone through arts. And I remember talking to Wendy Alexander, who very briefly was First Minister in Scotland, and she had, when she was sort of training herself up as a civil servant and then politician, she said to me that she had gone off to the States to learn how to distribute money, because that was infinitely more difficult to do well than it was to fundraise and receive it, which kind of really struck a chord when we were doing this work. But the first thing that John, when he started doing the research, focused on was the do no harm principle. You know, kind of Hippocratic oath approach. You know, you shouldn't, you know, intelligent funders should not take organisations off mission, should not be over demanding, you know, in comparison to either the money that they were putting in on scale, the size of the operation, and so on. But of course, within that context, we were also asking questions. I mean, the Hippocratic Oath is based on some kind of premise of sanctity of life, whereas we were actually starting to ask questions about, well, should arts organisations just continue indefinitely, and what would a good death mean? Something that's kind of come up quite frequently. It was one of the reasons why I wanted Alex Bigwood to be here, because he's just closed down his organisation, and there were 3 or 4 organisations at the end of last year that closed in London, really out of the leader's decision, and they closed down very, very well, very effectively, and with great dignity, as opposed to being either crashing or being forced to close. So the do no harm principle is not actually as straightforward as we kind of once thought. And also, in the time that we developed that work, there have been various changes in people trying to do different approaches to funding, from kind of much more peer-assessed models of funding, to that we kind of touched on a little bit earlier, the sort of venture philanthropy approach, where, you know, the money goes in a kind of grant type approach, but comes with kind of a whole kind of management consulting approach from the funder, either direct from the person who's giving the money themselves or from consultants that they appoint. So which can be, you know, it was very, very trendy for about sort of 5-10 years ago, and there's still organisations still functioning like that. But it creates its own difficulty, both in terms of capacity and resource, but also, as I think we all know, it's quite difficult to explain well the balance that we in the arts put into the artistic quality and mission, and the way that we use resources. I do think it's quite different to kind of to other not-for-profit ventures, and I don't think we've yet articulated what that balance is very well. And a lot of that learning, in terms of these new approaches to funding, is coming from the kind of creative industry, social innovation sphere. So you sort of see places like the British Council Cultural Economy Programme really not actually that interested in arts organisations anymore. They're much more interested in social innovation and design folk, because their methods and processes are so different, and actually the arts sectors don't get looking and don't get prioritised in that system. And my worry is that we're going more and more towards, and that's certainly my experience in London and Scotland, and it may be very different from you here, and it may be very different in the context of the Arts Council England. But it's, you know, for me, although I work often in the creative industries in terms of kind of film and the borderline craft and so on, but it's a very, very different kind of work that's produced, the quality of depth, the kind of relationships, the kind of impact, and really, in this, you know, they're shallower. They have different, you know, and the kinds of intelligences that are used are very different. And the other thing I think that's changed a lot since we looked at all of this work is that we're seeing things more systemically, and therefore what does that mean for us as individual organisations? What responsibilities do we have to impact further up the food chain, never mind further down, because that creates its own complexity in terms of advocacy and the kind of stories that we tell in terms of fundraising. So my questions around intelligent funding are much more at the human end and how those impact on the operational end, because if we keep going without developing into a more relationship type approach and a more systemic approach to intelligent funding, we're taking ourselves more and more into a place of overwhelm. You know, stress levels, you know, the impact on staffing, and employment, and you know, all of those sorts of things that actually take a long time to get over if they're not managed well. And it kind of is very related to quite a lot of work that MMM has done around what we call the people theme, which is, you know, it's not just the skills that we need in the arts, it's also the kind of qualities and attributes that we need in order to be able to operate at times of massive change, which we think need to be applied to funders as well as, not because, you know, when I left Derwent in 2009, so it was just after the crash, and I had to make that decision because if I didn't, well, I had two choices. One was to deal with a foundation whose income was going to be significantly less, and therefore completely have to change our funding streams, or kind of leave on a high and allow somebody kind of younger to come in and then kind of learn while the markets started to improve, and I think they certainly have. But we see that with all the foundations went through that process. And now the pressure on the foundations, because of the different cuts both in local authorities and in terms of the public funding sector, are huge. So what we're going to see over the next year for all those foundations that we've just been talking about is much more pressure. And of course, changes in personnel dramatically affect the kind of approaches and cultures that they take, particularly if they're not that interested in or don't get our world and default to a kind of either social innovation, creative industries type approach, which, you know, within these four walls is where Paul Hamlin is at the moment, Esme Fairbairn may well follow, and yet we've got a very kind of diminished kind of public art system in terms of impact, because they're running kind of bureaucracies, much tighter bureaucracies with fewer resources. So my kind of question so how do we keep doing this in terms of a funding environment that makes us feel still healthy? And how do we create a sort of flip so that we can either change our business models or change our ways of thinking so that we don't go into overwhelm and we can still look after the system, even if we can't always look after every single individual. You know, what are the ways that, you know, in terms of income, there's other ways that we can look after folks. So for me, it becomes it is a very human thing, very much as you were talking about when you were talking about relationships. Always trying to keep a sense of relationship as opposed to that trend. And that's what I wanted to sort of get to a bit later. In the US, people are trained to be funders. You know, people go do MAs on how to be a good funder. I mean, that's largely in the trust and foundation world because there's so little in the public sector. But even in the national endowment, people are going through they're doing PhDs on how to be good at what they do. And so the kind of thinking that they've developed from grant to investment, you know, language that has kind of been really difficult for our sector, is really quite sophisticated. And it was against that backdrop, and I'd be really interested to hear a bit later what you think, but it was against that backdrop that we came across the Dance of Deceit paper that we sent through, you know, where that balance between clear communication, integrity and compassion from funders as opposed to a kind of a power and control approach is the same way that we would behave when we're, you know, to try and recreate an equilibrium. There's an American choreographer called Liz Lerman who has developed a form of critical response for artists when they're developing work. She does extraordinary work, but she also she always talks about hiking the horizontal. She always does this gesture where you kind of move from anything that's kind of hierarchical that way to things that are along a spectrum, and that was the kind of culture that we wanted to create with the intelligent funding work. And and I'll go through some of the things that John Nell said, but when we went through that work, our aim was to bring all the funders together, the public funders and the trusts and foundations together, and this was in 2007, to agree to a kind of cultural Kyoto, sign up to a set of kind of statements that they would all sign up to. We couldn't get people in the same room. They didn't at that point, and I think it would be very, very different now. They were all really concerned about their own individual identities in the same way that different organisations, wanted to kind of keep really clear about their branding, about their personality, about, irrespective of what we said about having to answer to so many masters and people having to fill in like one evaluation form that looked like that, and another evaluation form that looked like that, and having 10 of them at different points in the year, and not being able to sort of do, they really couldn't hear that. And now they're in a place where they're starting, across the board, and now really don't have the resources even to think in that kind of bespoke way, which is where I think the crisis is. But what the Dance of Deceit was saying is that, you've got people who kind of see themselves in, as opposed to on the spectrum that way, see themselves in a position of power. There's a kind of hubris that develops with having the money to spend, and then creates a kind of create that dysfunctional relationship down to the chief exec, who then passes it that kind of, you're never quite lying, but you say something slightly different to your board than you probably, you actually need to happen. And then the chief exec of the funding relationship is saying something slightly different to their board in order to get the board to sort of say that's okay. You kind of end up with this web of, not quite being really clear about what the stuff of it, and the data and the information is never quite in the right place. And that's absolutely the way we worked at Jerwood. No question. I had a board of lords and ladies, much like the current English government, all Victorians, who really just wanted to see kind of, somebody from Oxbridge being funded for something that would be in the Times. That was what I had to do. So obviously I had to go through all sorts of ways to try and make sure that wasn't the only thing. But I had to do a little bit of that. But of course then I would never say that to the public. I would never be going out to. But of course, behind the scenes, there would be all sorts of problems. And if they didn't like the work, if it was too contemporary, then that would really be a massive challenge. To the extent that the day I left Jerwood, we announced the Jerwood Sculpture Award. It had gone through proper diligence, fantastic panel of experts. Had selected 7 works, all the maquettes were on display. We had massive public, Nick Sirota there from the Tate presenting the award. The award goes to the winner gets £15,000. The day after I left, I got a call from my successor saying that the chairman of the foundation was refusing to let that piece happen. I mean, he would never have done that to me, but he pulled the piece. 2 years later, I get a call from the Times saying, we've heard that wasn't actually, it wasn't because of planning permission that piece wasn't. No, I think it was planning permission. I'm sure I remember it was planning permission.
I've been in a position where public consultation schemes about different designs of the artwork have been put out to the public for voting, and then there's been a long process in between for counting the votes.
Yeah.
To make sure
the
piece that was selected was the one that the council was selected, and yet 6.
And so I suppose the thing for me is how do we create a culture of honesty kind of in that system, rather than a culture of fear. So when we were going through the challenges around Creative Scotland, Scotland and that public system, because having been through the process of setting up the organisation, and it was very much based on the SN. So, we knew, there was a system where the SNP have got the economy at the top of their agenda. That's filtered down to Creative Scotland's kind of aspiration. So all their programme is created around either some sort of brown Scotland, or it's about creating the kind of economic arguments. So all the assessment, everything had to happen. And it completely changed the way that they lost all their art form knowledge. And so there were film people making decisions about gallery-related, so they completely didn't understand the models or the etiquettes or anything of the financial arrangements. And nobody could challenge, nobody was willing to say, because decisions were being made in very maverick ways, that nobody was willing to challenge. So it created an ongoing sense of fear. Now, I'm not saying that that's the system that we're all talking about, certainly that wasn't, but the ability to speak back or to be able to articulate really well without raising people's angers or a sense of anxiety or whatever are the kinds of skills that are going to be really important in how we change the system. So I'd be very curious when if that sort of sense of levels of deceit, and that's a pretty harsh word, it may not be that. I was doing a budget the other day for a project. Obviously I've got to get my 10%, either cash or in kind from somewhere else, and make sure that I've got my percentages right. So I kind of, sort of making sure that I'm going to get cover my, because I can't do core costs, can't do full cost recovery in this particular, particular approach. So I have to be really clever and canny about how I make sure that I do, because I couldn't function if I didn't do that. So that's already me playing a game with my budgets and presenting. And one of the things is that and I would be interested, you present slightly different versions of your business plan to different people. And what does that do for you when you're trying to steer a ship in a particular direction? And is that the kind of the right way to go about things? So the sorts of things that we kind of identified about poor funding or unintelligent funding, cutting the amount that you ask for. So you ask for £100,000 and you get 80. Without any rhyme or reason, without any questions, without what. So I've been noticing funders stopped doing that for a while, and they've started doing that again. Expecting challenge funding in a difficult economic environment is a really difficult one. Sometimes you can argue that with funding that you've already got. We did a lot of work on reserves policies and tried to do a lot of advocacy with the public funding sector in particular, but around encouraging healthy reserves and reserves policies. But there are still funders who will penalise if there's a reserve, if you've got reserves, and certainly funders who will penalise success. I got a grant from a public sector funding agency last week, and I'm still in fundraising mode for this particular project, but one of the lines in the contract was that if I get money from any other public sector body, they will reduce my funding. And I'm trying to create a more, whereas my public funding is kind of an investment, which I hope will, and then I'll be earning my own income with it, but I still need some more money. So that, that those kind of challenges remain. And I think I was talking earlier about sort of balance sheet means that when we would look at applications at Durwood, we would look first at the balance sheet, and then we would look at the application. And the balance sheet does not tell. It does for financial folk. It does absolutely. It's completely the right model for for a financial system. It is absolutely not the way to tell a story about an organisation. So those sorts of things we need to start to be able to get to, well, as the funders need to kind of get better at. But if, you know, the majority of your board are kind of city-based folk or come from, you know, kind of other professions, then it becomes really, you know, use the tools that they understand. So that's one of the things that we've been trying to address at NNN. Then the innovation issue, of course, is really challenging. It's challenging for funders, it's challenging for us, but at the same time, it is an area that we need to address. One of the things that Alex Fleetwood talks about is because he comes from the gaming sector and is trying to keep gaming, and not necessarily gaming in the digital sense, but gaming as a way of communicating, creating games that created their own theatre, and was held up as an innovator in terms of his business model, but because he was gaming, they just couldn't fund him. The Arts Council did not know how to put any money into him, so he would be constantly brought up at every conference to stand up and say how fantastic his work was, but could never get any, by the Arts Council in England, and everybody would be saying, this is the man to follow, but never got any money. So the sorts of things that we had in our original kind of Kyoto Agreement was to fund activity with close fit between mission and core values, to develop funding agreements that are either light touch or highly tailored to know when you do those, develop long-term funding agreements and relationships, and also between government and public infrastructure, not just between funder and grantees, so kind of again that sort of systemic approach. To commit to being proportionate in terms of perceived risk and evaluation and reporting, and to ensure that the cost or the price of the grant and the price of the activity reflects full cost of delivery. That one has never really happened. Incentivise rather than penalise organisations, particularly around building up reserves, to start to explore different business models and legal structures, to fund growth and capitalisation, fund better capitalisation, better assets with support, and to establish and enshrine. So this is like a minor one; it should actually be really at the top. To establish and enshrine the centrality and importance of arts and culture in our curriculum, that's education. Lobby for a tax regime that encourages new forms of patronage and giving. So that was what we wanted everybody to sign up to, and I think most of those remain quite relevant, but there's something in there that doesn't touch yet on some of the things that you talked about around the actual relationship stuff to do with honesty, respect and transparency, collaboration, I think. And I still think those are really important. Before we go on to the next bit, I was going to just show you 3 tools. Because I think this is the relationship between funders and grantees is about power. There's a guy called Adam Kahane who has written a book called Power and Love, and he did all the early work in South Africa towards the end of apartheid, and was brought in by one of the kind of big global consultancy firms, largely, even though he got a call from one of the universities in South Africa and said, look, we need somebody here, and they were all busy, and so he got the job and then stayed out there and got married. But he developed a set of processes to help to deal with conflict, and then has since done conflict resolution all over the world. And his thing is that, you know, if you understand power as the ability to act, good power is the ability to act, and good love is the ability to relate, as opposed to negative power, which is power over and controlling, and negative love is when it's just all fluffy and, you know, kind of the early days of a relationship. That if you try and get onto that dynamic, it's a really important dynamic to sort of stay on, and I suppose that's the bit to sort of start to think about in terms of our relationship with funders and those that we might fund. So just wanted to mention him. Then the other one is a little while with the International Future Forum, who also work with MMM for a number of years, and have since been working with Watershed in Bristol on all their producers' work, trying to understand what the role of the producer might be. And they talk about the love-fear loop. And actually, I think it's better if you talk about it as the love-power loop, because what they're saying is that there are sides of the whole, which is, I think, the same thing that Adam Hay is talking about. And so, what happens? So, in the fear kind of power loop, things tend to be quantitative, they tend to be individualistic, they tend to be more abstract, structured, planned, and homogenized. And they operate kind of in a more controlling perspective. In the love loop, it's much more about an emergent process, participatory, kind of there's more diversity, it's more about connection, it's more about the kind of becoming. And what happens, and what has happened in the last sort of 20 years or so, and I think, well, much less so, I think, in the last few years, but still needs work, is that we've kind of got stuck in there and not done enough to highlight the impact of this in terms of our organisational operations. And it's kind of a yin-yang, it needs to be in balance. You absolutely need the quantitative as well as the qualitative. You need to be able to abstract from data, you need to be able to kind of understand that whole, but we need also to put as much emphasis on this side in terms of the systems and the whole. And then the other one, which is another tool that we use a lot at MMM, also comes from the International Futures Forum, and they're still doing quite a bit of work on it, is the Three Horizons. Have you talked about the Three Horizons in any of the... No. So it's something to not take overly seriously, but it's really, really... So, once you start to go into it too much, I'm not sure it computes, but it's actually a really useful tool. So, if that is time, and this is impact, different sectors would use something slightly, some sectors might put money there, but at any point in time, you've got what's called the first horizon, which is the dominant kind of establishment. You have a second horizon, which is always kind of there to sort of challenging the first horizon, but often working with it. And then you've got in any point in time, you've got a third horizon, which is always kind of at the innovative, kind of at the edge, or what would Claire Cooper call them? What's the fringe dwelling? Change agent. Fringe dwelling change agents. These points here tend to be points of conflict. And you can map the line slightly differently. I mean, in our world, I would always, you would put the first horizons of kind of people who are getting regular money, the people with the money, the people who are making the decisions, large organisations. Then you've got the people who are, I would put MMM kind of in this place, we're starting to sort of try and identify them, and then inevitably artists and art, kind of tend to kind of come into this group. And what you can do is use that as a tool to just kind of map. You can do it for yourself. I mean, I use it for, when I'm communicating with people. I know when I'm in the first horizon mode and when I'm in my most hippie mode. And when I'm kind of operating in this place, and they require quite different styles of approach, quite different styles of communication, different environments, So, this is a good board meeting with a proper agenda and kind of really good minutes. And this is just, kind of a bit more random, a bit more, and so somehow kind of using those tools in different ways. You can use it for your organisation, you can use it sectorally, you can use it and it's become a really useful way. So we will often say to each other, that's very first horizon, or that's very second horizon. It's a sort of shorthand for something that's just coming out that needs a different kind of, and will take a different kind of time to come out. And There's no judgment on any of those. It's not a judgment call. You know, you can. I think you can have a very positive first horizon and a very negative first horizon approach in there. And so those are just kind of tools that help us to try and think a bit differently about the way that we react, you know, the way we are kind of systemically. So what I wanted to do, I mean, are there any questions from anything that I've said or anything?
Can you go back to the other
Yeah.
talk about the photo space now?
Which one do?
The power. Yeah. That's it.
I was going to ask you on that, would you, I was thinking that qualitative as opposed to quantitative kind of goes in that route.
Yeah.
You define the second horizon again?
People who are trying to make change without challenging the system.
Like?
You probably have kind of different, let me just think, people like, what do they call them, think tanks. That sort of kind of model works. Yeah.
Yeah. But there are lots of small arts organisations working with
I would agree. Arts organisations definitely.
It's comfortable to take risks when you're trying to make systems.
That's right.
I'll send out, it's all on the site, but I'll send out a specific link for it. It's quite an interesting paper in terms of it, because it's almost, you'll notice that the horizon content of it almost look.
Well, that's what they say. I'm not always convinced, but it's always there. It's always present. So what will shift is that this approach will slightly shift, and a new kind of culture and approach will come up, and eventually, you get your Silicon Valley, and will start to take.
I'm just wondering whether the first horizon is a more predictable thing that isn't so much of a,
Well,
more of a sort of tootling along without actually being great.
If you look at different, I mean, you probably, if you went through this yourself, you might create a slightly different graph. Because yes, you could absolutely have kind of, and in some places, sort of in rural Scotland, you probably put the first horizon here and the second horizon, and they would be kind of next to no. But that's not actually true anymore, because I think that's,
There seems to be this slow-boiling, exploratory what-ifs
exactly.
Which, I mean, anything that is a what-if could actually be brilliant. Might be.
Yeah.
It might be
Yeah.
brilliant.
And it may create its own challenge.
Safe stuff.
I think
Yes.
it's quite interesting though, in the words actually, because in the region we work in, I think this first horizon, second horizon, there's agents, there's artists, and there's some really significant international artists in our region who just don't even bother to show their work in words at all. They're not in our region really celebrated because they've just gone out beyond that. And
Yes.
but, we'd have to do three-dimensional.
And do you think, just instinctively, do you think you would put those in the first horizon? Those.
No, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think they are on that.
Yeah.
Because of the nature of their work, really so exciting and
Right.
out there. I think because of the scale and the scope of what Wales can do as a really small nation, they just don't engage with it. There's nothing for them to engage with.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I mean, because we have a number of visual artists who won't connect to anything, in terms of national, or see themselves own their identity as either with London galleries or international.
But I also think the timescale thing is about the here and the now, what's happening at this minute.
That's right. And it's where you want to get to.
What's coming? This looking at the bigger picture. What are the things that snowball is on the horizon? But also the impact on your organisation that you need to be working towards. So I sort of think there's quite often we're living in different timescales
Yes.
within our organisation. The immediate stuff that we're doing in our business plan, a big project, but then there's the business plans are to do with the Arts Council, something else what you did moving forward. I don't know. But I know what the ethos, I know the themes, but I have no idea of the detail. Unlike an organisation like Welsh National Opera, it has no detail, probably 10 years in advance. Actually, that's not the best way for us to work.
No. It's interesting as well that the other thing about First Horizon is that quite often, in order to remain up top, as it were, if you look at the start of the whole thing, there's an implication that it's at the top. First Horizon quite often, and depends what insert your own word here, borrows, collaborates, steals Horizon 2 thinking in order to remain Horizon 1.
Exactly.
But of course, at some point, it's interesting that you put the areas of conflict and all that sort of stuff in there. But then Horizon 1 finds it incredibly difficult to engage with Horizon 3 thinking. Because it's so far from it. But actually, in the long run, it will be that
Well, it
becomes Horizon 1.
become closer and closer.
What really floats my boat is about how people can work in partnerships, how different organisations can help each other within the sector. Because we've all got these different sort of timescales, different horizons. And you've got some organisations that work better in one horizon, and some working better in a different horizon. How collaboratively we can help each other.
But also, for me, what information you need in order to make that, it's kinds of relationships, but also the information that you need in order, what's enough information in order for that to be useful and helpful?
Yeah.
And what sort of process of joining and dating do you go through? To
It's,
build trust or how much time?
I said about the surfing and the big ships, but we were all on the same sea. And I just thought, how we negotiate.
Yes, the metaphors are really good.
It's actually, I think that's the way we can get some really interesting work as well. That feels right for it's that thing about the good fit, isn't it? And a lot of it, I know it's really unpopular to talk about gut instincts, but I'm sure we all know in our organisations what feels like a good fit. When I was instinctively, we know that even if it's something a bit left field, it's a bit weird, but actually there is a fit there, and you can sort of taste it.
Yeah, I think that is wonderful, because I think it's about culture and attitudes to risk. So
Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah. And about how some organisations are easier, find it an easier situation to negotiate risk than others, or in certain circumstances they do.
Yeah.
I just think there's a lot more we can do collectively.
I mean, so I'm going to do the next session much more on kind of the leadership and the people kind of related stuff, like how do you both find time at the same time as make decisions. But when I went for my interview with Jarwood, and the chairman sort of said, "So what do you think? What skills and things you're going to need to do when you come here?" And I thought, I'm going to need a strategy, a business plan, and a marketing plan. And he said, forget all that stuff. You're going to need to just make decisions and trust your instinct. That's all you need to do.
And it's weird because that's something that people really don't like to say. The idea of making decisions and trusting your instinct is like anathema to lots of funding organisations.
Yes.
Yeah. You can make a case for options and a favoured option, but it's actually,
But
the recruitment
yeah.
plans and how to recruit people.
So just based on that, I just want to sort of spend half an hour or so just dividing you up into two groups, maybe the table so that you can write. And I've got 3 questions. You may not get to all of them, but kind of what did you hear as in what did you learn from the conversations that we've had in the morning so far? What was interesting, what was challenging? What shift and I put the word culture, in our culture of funding ecology that would make the most difference to you as a group. And then just see if you can start to identify, without asking for any more money, what would be 2 small small practical things in one large thing that would really make an impact, would make a difference to you, you know, without looking for, you know, we all need more money. But just from the conversation that we've had this morning. Yeah, just exactly half an hour. And so if one of you would